I guess we'll start off this morning. So hi everyone, I'm Darlene. I work with Engagement and Communications branch at the AER, and I'll be your facilitator for today's information session. So just to start with, I'll pass it to Leanne Chartrand, who will offer a land acknowledgement. Leanne.
Hi, good morning, everybody. The Alberta Energy Regulator recognizes that this land we call Alberta is the traditional territory of many Indigenous peoples who have cared for it for generations. We want to thank those generations of Indigenous peoples, both past and present, for sharing this land with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Leanne. And then I will now pass to Kristen Nielsen for her opening words. Krista.
Thanks, Darlene. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I'm Kristen Nielsen, manager of the Regulatory Application Support Group at the Alberta Energy Regulator. Thank you for taking your time to join us today and learn about the Closure Nomination Program. This program is part of the overall Government of Alberta policy to reduce aging infrastructure in the province. This presentation is your first opportunity to provide feedback through both your questions and comments you shared today, as well as the follow-up survey. There'll also be another opportunity to provide more feedback in November. We look forward to hearing your questions and receiving your feedback. This will help us complete the development of the program. Darlene, I'll pass it back to you. Thanks.
Thanks, Krista. So I want to welcome you all, and we all know how valuable your time is and are very grateful that you're able to join us as we share information about the AER's Closure Nomination Program. So the purpose of this session is to help you understand how the program affects you, answer your questions about the information presented, and give you an opportunity to provide feedback through a survey. So directly following the session, you will be sent the survey and a link to this presentation. So we are excited that there's approximately 20-ish people that have registered for this session. And we also have representatives attending from the Alberta Energy Regulator, the Government of Alberta, so Department of Energy and Environment and Parks, and Indian Oil and Gas. So a little bit about kind of what to expect this morning is the session is scheduled for 2 hours. The presentation will be about 45 minutes. So while the presentation is being presented, please save questions to the end of the presentation. And if you hear something, just make note of it so that if something comes up for you, you remember when we open up the Q&A session. After the presentation, there'll be a 5-minute break. And at that time, you can start entering your questions into the Q&A. From there, the remaining time will be the question and answer time, and we'll be using the Q&A function to receive typed questions, and I'll give a little bit of more detail about that when we finish the presentation and when we open the Q&A. So if we go to slide 2, so this is a little bit of housekeeping. If you are disconnected from the session or having any technical difficulties rejoining, please email the address on the screen. So christybrose@aer.ca. And if you need to join back by phone, then call the number above and enter the phone conference ID. You may want to take a screenshot of this or a picture of this slide to keep the information handy. And it was also sent out with the presentation that everybody received. I also want to say if we have any technical issues, we thank you in advance for your patience as we work through them. And please be aware that this session will be recorded, so it's recording right now for information purposes, and it will be posted on the AER website. So this morning we have 2 speakers from the Closure Nomination Project team, Tammy Turner and Jocelyn Haggerty. So to begin, I will pass it on to you, Tammy.
Thank you, Darlene. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Tammy Turner, and I'm part of the AER Closure Nomination Project team, as Darlene mentioned. Today, this is an engagement session where we are offering information as opposed to consulting, but we still hope that it provides value to your community. Today, we are talking about how the closure nomination program at the AER fits within the liability management framework, the differences between the program and the Government of Alberta's site rehabilitation program, as well as how to submit a site closure request and the closure plan expectations of oil and gas companies. At the end of the presentation, we'll show you the survey questions. And then, as mentioned, after the break, you can ask questions through the MS Teams Q&A function. So there's lots of slides to get through today. So let's start with the liability management framework, what closure is and how closure work currently happens within Alberta. The Closure Nomination Program is one of the programs within the AER to address the ongoing risks and costs associated with aging sites and facilities within Alberta. This new program allows eligible individuals and groups to have a voice in reducing liability. Some of the detailed processes and steps for this program are still a work in progress, but we are conducting engagement sessions anyway now, so we get your feedback about what is missing and what is not to help further develop the program. Next slide, please. Slide 6, please, Christy.
It's showing slide 6 on my side. It may just take a moment here.
Okay, I'll start anyway. The AER was directed by the Government of Alberta to implement the Closure Nomination Program as part of their liability management framework. The liability management framework is government policy introduced in 2020, which includes a series of programs to improve and expedite cleanup and closure of oil and gas infrastructure. The GOA directed the AER to implement the 5 components shown in light blue and gray boxes in the diagram. The dark blue boxes at the top show the life cycle or stages of oil and gas resource development, which includes planning, construction, operation, and then closure. The 5 components of the liability management framework are highlighted in the light blue and gray boxes. So inventory reduction is the highlighted red box on the slide, and the purpose of this component of the framework is to increase the amount of closure work occurring in Alberta. It includes 2 programs, which are closure targets and closure nomination. The program we are talking about today is closure nomination, and closure nomination allows eligible stakeholders to influence closure priorities. Of note, however, this closure nomination program is referred to as the opt-in mechanism in the GOA policy. Next slide, please. At the end of this presentation, we are providing a link to a series of YouTube videos for more information on the liability management framework and the programs identified on this slide. Looks like we're just having some technical difficulties, folks. Okay. And it might be my computer, so I'll just keep going on. If we're on slide 7, which is site closure overview. It's probably a good idea for clarity to go over some of the terms we'll be using in the program. Closure occurs during the last stage of the oil and gas development life cycle. So initiate refers to the planning and application stage. Construct means the construction and building of a well or facility. Operate means the operation and maintenance of a well or facility. And close means the process of permanently ending the resource development site once the resource has been removed or when removing the resource is no longer economical. I've just been told that I'm freezing up a little bit on the computer here, so I'm just going to turn off my camera and hopefully that helps. So closure includes removal of equipment and the permanent end of operations. An abandonment is the removal of equipment and for a well placing plugs downhole so no liquid can be released, and then cutting the well casing below the surface. The abandonment of a facility includes taking apart and removal of all associated equipment and structures. Remediation is any activity to remove or treat contaminated soil, groundwater, or vegetation. Revegetation includes soil replacement and recontouring, then seeding and tree planting. Reclamation is applying for a certificate once the oil and gas company can show they have returned the land to a state functionally equivalent to what it was before the development took place. We know that this is a simple representation of the closure process, and some sites will need more for remediation and reclamation. The closure nomination program will recognize that the time it takes to complete each stage may vary depending on the site and how the land functioned before it was disturbed. Next slide, please. So slide 8, how closure currently happens. Oil and gas companies are responsible for the proper abandonment, remediation, and reclamation of their sites. There are several things that may trigger closure activity occurring on a site. Licensees initiate closure work as a business decision when the sites are no longer needed. Area-based closure provides an opportunity to collaborate between licensees and service providers, with participants sharing resources, technology, and information, thus improving the efficiency of closure work, driving down the unit cost. There are also regulatory requirements that require closure activity to occur. As mentioned, the inventory reduction program currently has the closure spend targets. The AR may also direct closure work through orders, for example, abandonment closure remediation, which may be issued if a company is incapable or unwilling to meet AR requirements and or provide proper care and custody of its energy infrastructure. So Section 78 of the Indian Oil and Gas Regulations requires closure activity of any well and facility if the lands in a surface contract area are no longer used for the uses for which the contract was granted. This regulation is administered by Indian Oil and Gas Canada, or IOGC. Some sites are also directed by the AR to the Alberta Orphan Well Association to complete closure work. The OWA is an independent nonprofit organization that operates under the delegated legal authority of the AR. Their job is to close wells, facilities, and pipelines that do not have a solvent and responsible owner. In addition to all these other ways that closure happens, the closure nomination program provides the opportunity for eligible requests to nominate other sites that may not already have closure work planned or occurring. So now I'll pass it to Jocelyn to provide further overview of the program. Jocelyn?
Thanks, Tammy. So hi, my name is Jocelyn Haggerty, and I work with Tammy and a member of the Closure Nomination Program project team. So this next section provides an overview of the Closure Nomination Program and its relationship to the Government of Alberta's Site Rehabilitation Program. Next slide, please. So the Government of Alberta Site Rehabilitation Program, or slide 10, the nomination of sites for closure began with the Government of Alberta's Site Rehabilitation Program, or SRP, which was supported by federal funding to get Albertans working. The SRP enabled private landowners, First Nation reserves, and Métis settlements to nominate sites. Closure activity through the program required that contracts with service providers be in place. The SRP program and known funding for closure activity will conclude in 2023. The AER's closure nomination program broadens eligible requesters to a larger audience, and closure activity is funded by licensees. Sites nominated through SRP are the first sites being considered for the closure nomination program. New nominations can be submitted starting in April 2023. Next slide, thanks. So consideration of the SRP sites. So the AR reviewed the sites nominated through SRP and identified those that were eligible for the closure nomination program. In August, we sent out emails to the requesters to let them know if their sites met or did not meet the closure nomination criteria, and if they had or had not been accepted into the program. These notifications were site-specific, and you may have received multiple notifications if you had more than one site nominated. Please contact inventory.reduction@aer.ca if you have any questions regarding the notifications that you received. To be clear, those who have or are receiving funding through SRP are not eligible for the closure nomination program. Later, if SRP funded work is done, but the site is not fully closed, a closure request for that site can be resubmitted to the closure nomination program. Until then, please continue to direct SRP inquiries to energy.srp@gov.ab.ca. Next slide, please. Perfect. Closure program overview. So this diagram shows an overview of the closure nomination program from start to finish. The closure nomination program begins with a request for closure of a specific site. There are criteria that must be met by both the requester and the site nominated. Each site is then evaluated to ensure that it meets the requirements of the closure nomination program. Once the site is accepted into the program, licensees are required to prepare a closure plan. In the upcoming slides, you will see that there are 3 closure plan pathways that the AER will make available to oil and gas companies. And then finally, the AER will monitor compliance against closure plans, and progress will be reported to requesters as closure activity proceeds. Next slide, please. So this is the rules. So yeah, slide 13, please. I'm not sure what's happened there. There we go. Thank you. Rules. So after describing the program overview, we want to clearly identify who is part of the closure nomination program and what are their roles. So the requester, you, the eligible individuals and groups that can submit site closure requests to the AER. You can also view updates as closure work progresses. Oil and gas companies, the owner of the well or facility. At the AER, we refer to them as licensees or industry. They are responsible for planning, conducting, and reporting on closure work once they receive a site closure request. And then oil and gas regulators. We review, make decisions on, and monitor oil and gas resource development by means of rules and regulations. There are 2 regulators responsible for directing, reviewing, and monitoring closure activities on First Nations reserve lands. Ourselves, the Alberta Energy Regulator, AER, and the Indian Oil and Gas Canada, IOGC. Later in the presentation, we will explain what closure activities are regulated by which regulator. Tammy will now explain the eligibility requirements and how to submit a site closure request.
Hi, folks. I seem to be having some technical difficulties, so I'm going to speak, but again, turn my camera off just to save the bandwidth here. So according to the oil and gas conservation rules, to be eligible to request closure of a site, the requester is the council of a band on its First Nation reserve lands, Métis settlement councillor or chairperson, private landowner or title holder on private land owned by the landowner, a disposition holder of certain public lands, act dispositions if the well or facility is on a public land, a municipal councillor, mayor, or reeve for a site on land owned by a municipality. The minister is also an eligible requester for sites on public lands. This enables site nomination under the closure nomination program throughout the province. And as a manager of public lands, the government of Alberta can nominate sites to the AER, which would then follow the same process as other nominated sites. Next slide, please. So on slide 16, eligible sites include oil and gas wells or facilities which are inactive or abandoned for 5 or more years, but does not include pipelines. Sites that already have a reclamation certificate or are reclamation exempt, which means closure activities were completed prior to current standards being in place, are not part of the closure nomination program. We are waiting for GOA policy direction on these sites. Just a reminder that reclamation means the land has been returned to a state functionally equivalent to what it was before the development took place. We are aware that IOGC is currently reviewing wells on First Nation reserve lands to confirm the status of sites currently labeled as exempt and working with provincial regulators to reclassify them to a more appropriate status, such as abandoned or to reclamation certified if required. This diagram shows the overall process for requesting closure of a site, including verification of whether the site meets the required criteria. The AER is the regulator responsible for receiving and validating site closure requests. If a request meets the information requirements required by the AER, it can be submitted. It will be given a request identification number or nomination number by the database, which will automatically check some of the criteria for the site. Example, the site has been inactive or abandoned for 5 or more years. In most cases, though, we foresee that this initial verification will be automated. If the closure request is valid and meets the eligibility criteria, its status will be updated on dashboards available to requesters and licensees. So if the closure request does not meet the eligibility criteria, it is not posted on the dashboards, but the requester is notified. On the next slide, so this is what submitting a request for closure will look like. So only an eligible requester can submit a request for closure, and eligible requesters are required to certify the accuracy of that information. So the AER has a set of minimum information requirements and is developing a web-based closure request intake form. So with controlled fields, including contact information for both eligible requester and anyone they have supporting them with their request. Requester type, such as landowner or municipality, location, site identifier, site information, and conditions. We are asking for this information to automate the submission of a request as much as possible. If an eligible requester does not have internet access, AER phone-in contacts will be provided to assist in the completion of the form. So when requests are received, though, they will be assessed to determine if they meet the required criteria. For invalid sites, requesters will be notified by email and no further action will be taken. Valid requests, however, will continue through the closure nomination process. On the next slide is the dashboard. So this is what the public dashboard for the closure nomination program may look like. There's a lot of information here, but it will be public-facing report on the AER.ca, and those requesters can have access to see the status of their closure request. If posted and seen on the dashboard, that means the request has undergone initial AER verification and is eligible. This looks like, again, like a lot of information, but it can be easily filtered to a specific location or nomination number to reduce the volume of data that you see. And then the table at the top, which is called nomination details, provides details about the closure request, what AER license it is associated with, its location, and the licensee of record. We will display the requester type. So for example, Métis settlement, municipality, etc., and location. The requester's name or contact information, however, will not be displayed. The bottom table, which is status progression, provides detail on the progress of closure activity for the site. And there's also a map that you can zoom in and out of. And what you see along the right side is a series of search and filtering capabilities. Next slide, please. At the same time, a valid site closure request is posted on the public dashboard. The licensee will receive notification that they have a site closure request. The details of the site closure requests are also going to be posted in One Stop, and that is an AER system that industry uses. The notification to the licensee starts the time clock for the licensee to choose a closure plan pathway. Jocelyn will explain now the details of closure plans. She'll do that a little bit later on, sorry. If licensees notice a discrepancy with the eligibility of the request, they have 30 calendar days from notification to let us know and to provide evidence. For example, maybe the site is active when the licensee must provide current production records. So, or if the requester does not match the licensee's records, then a copy of the surface lease agreements or current land title must be submitted. On the next slide, we want to point out that only the requester can withdraw their request. The method for withdrawing a request is still under development. So the closure plan. So Jocelyn now will describe the closure plan pathway options available to oil and gas companies within the closure nomination program. Jocelyn?
Great, thanks, Tammy. We'll move ahead to the next slide, please. When we talk about the closure plan requirements. The oil and gas conservation rules require that a licensee of a well or facility prepare a closure plan when a request has been made to the AER by an eligible requester. Licensees are expected to prepare closure plans. However, to streamline our processes, the AER does not require all closure plans to be submitted. The AR may request any closure plan for review or audit, even if it was not originally submitted. We will provide some examples of cases where closure plans are not required in the upcoming slides. Licensees have 90 calendar days from the notification of a site closure request to choose a closure plan path option. Example, if the closure request notification is received on September 1st, 2023, the licensee has 90 days from September 1st to choose their closure plan path and inform the AER of their choice. Where possible, the AER will require licensees to align their closure plans to meet standard milestones and timelines set by the AER for closure activities. The AER understands that some sites may be more complex, and for these sites, licensees will be required to prepare closure plans with measurable, transparent milestones that can be made publicly available. Next slide, please. So the closure plan paths. A closure plan is what an oil and gas company uses to describe the activities they will do, including timelines, to return the land to a state equivalent to what it was before the development took place. Our overall approach to closure plans is to create flexibility for licensees. We want this program to be successful and to integrate with other AER processes. There are 3 closure plan pathways licensees can choose to define the closure milestones for a site. Licensees are required to identify their closure plan path within 90 days of being notified of the site closure request. The first option is baseline. If a licensee's prepared closure plan aligns with the milestones and timelines defined in the AER's baseline closure path, the licensee is to choose this option. The baseline timelines are for the closure nomination program only, but it is possible that timelines could be more stringent for a specific site if there are existing AER orders issued or if it is deemed necessary through another AER process. The second option is the non-baseline closure plan path, which is reserved for sites that are considered complex or high risk. Examples of complex or high risk sites will be provided in an upcoming slide. Choosing the non-baseline closure plan option requires AER approval. The licensee is also required to submit their closure plan and additional information for review by the AER. Regardless of whether the licensee selects the baseline or non-baseline path, milestones will be measurable and made publicly available on the closure nomination dashboard that Tammy showed earlier. The AER will also assess compliance to make sure that timelines are maintained and closure work is progressing. Licensees can also submit to have the site move between the baseline and non-baseline pathways as complexities arise. These requests will be reviewed by the AER, and transitions between the closure plan pathways will be transparent to all stakeholders and only completed as necessary. In a few cases, a site may require the third option, where a licensee can propose an alternative to preparing a closure plan. Examples could include a site in a transfer application, or if there is an application to amend its use. Impacts to the site must be imminent, and additional information will be required to support this argument. Choosing this option also requires AER approval. The AER will review and track each of these scenarios. Next slide, please. So these are the baseline closure milestones. In the baseline closure path, the milestones and timelines for meeting them are set. So for meeting the closure paths or activities are set. The baseline path eliminates the need for licensees to submit their closure plans for the nominated sites to the AER. This simplifies the AER's review process and ability to monitor progress or measure compliance. These timelines have been developed using historical closure data reported to the AER on the length of time it takes sites to reach certain closure milestones. Our initial assessments of reported data suggest that the baseline path would comfortably apply to at least 80% of sites and provide flexibility in planning closure work. This milestone approach will also allow requesters to see transparent and reasonable progress on the sites they have nominated. The timelines in this table are for closure activity on sites regulated by the AER from pre-abandonment to the submission of the reclamation certificate. We mentioned earlier that closure activity on First Nation reserved lands is regulated by both the AER and IOGC. On First Nation reserved land, the AER regulates closure activity from inactivity to abandonment only. This means inactive sites on First Nation reserve lands that follow the baseline pathway must complete abandonment activities within 3 years as per the first 2 rows of the table. The remaining timelines do not apply. Instead, after abandonment, it is the IOGC that regulates the remediation and reclamation activities. The IOGC will issue a Section 78 under the Indian Oil and Gas Regulations. The associated timelines and requirements have been established, and an information letter is forthcoming. The IOGC requires reclamation to be completed within 5 years. And I think for reclamation for IOGC, the term they use is a surrender application and approval, which I think was formerly called a memorandum of surrender. Next slide, please. So this goes a little bit more in depth into the non-baseline closure path. For the non-baseline closure path, licensees are required to prepare and submit their closure plans to AAR for review. As discussed, the non-baseline path may be more appropriate for complex sites or for certain licensees where additional work or time would be needed to complete the required closure activities described in the baseline path. We are still defining some of the details of the non-baseline pathway, including working with IOGC to kind of align our processes on complex sites on First Nation reserve lands. Triggers for this process may include, but are not limited to, contamination that cannot be addressed within 3 years, complex closure such as large infrastructure, and large volume of sites that have been nominated for a single licensee under the closure nomination program. Next slide, please. Okay, so the final plan, the final closure plan path is the case for no closure plan, which means if approved by the AAR, these sites would not need to be immediately brought to closure. Plans for these sites will also need to be submitted to the AAR describing the actions to be taken, and these will be reviewed by the AAR. Action on these sites should be imminent and must be completed according to any approval conditions set by the AAR. Choosing this path at the time of nomination does not mean that a site will never be required to reach closure. Once all activities have ceased, these sites will also be required to meet equivalent land capacity. And next slide. Closure monitored outside of the program. In some situations, the closure of nominated sites will be directed by processes outside of the closure nomination program. Where possible, the AAR will identify these sites through the initial verification process. Example situations where closure is not within the closure nomination program, but within another AAR process include a site associated with an insolvent oil and gas company may have a working interest participants that can work with the Orphan Well Association, or OWA, to close these sites. In most cases, there are orders issued to the working interest participants that would supersede the closure nomination program timelines. The AAR and IOGC also collaborate to manage the properties identified on First Nation reserve lands that are held by insolvent licensees. A site that has been orphaned, although eligible for the closure nomination program, is the responsibility of the OWA and will be prioritized based on the OWA's criteria for closure activity. The closure nomination program will direct requesters to that process, and the AAR will not implement any of the closure plan pathways. Next slide, please. So closure on First Nation reserve land. So we have mentioned a few times that closure work is regulated by the AAR and IOGC for sites on First Nation reserve lands. This slide is a summary of the content covered on previous slides. So as I had said before, the AAR regulates closure activity to abandonment. After abandonment, the IOGC regulates closure activities from the abandonment to reclamation, or the surrender application and approval. While the AAR and IOGC have separate closure regulations and requirements, we are working together to integrate and align processes where possible. As mentioned, the AAR regulates closure activity from inactivity to abandonment. Within the closure nomination program baseline closure path, the AAR requires abandonment to be completed within 3 years. This will apply to all sites, including those on First Nation reserve lands. The IOGC then regulates, as I said, after abandonment to the reclamation. However, licensees will still be required to report milestone and annual closure spend to the AAR. Site closure requests for sites on First Nation reserved lands that have already been abandoned are still submitted to the AER. We will validate and post those requests to the public dashboard and notify the licensee. The licensee will be required to follow IOGC regulations for the remaining closure work and not the requirements under the closure nomination program. This is also true for sites that enter the program as inactive. And then once the abandonment work is complete, at that point, the remaining closure work to bring the site to reclamation is under the IOGC jurisdiction. Next slide, please. Reporting on closure activity. So oil and gas companies are responsible for reporting on closure activity. The reporting requirements oil and gas companies must meet include annual closure spend by March 31st for every year for all closure activities completed by the licensee in the previous year. Reporting also, they must also report on the status of closure activities for sites under the closure nomination program. The AER will have further definition of reporting requirements prior to the program implementation. The AER will also update the public-facing dashboard when closure milestones are reported. And then next slide. Compliance. Compliance with the closure plan milestones is required. The AER will have desktop audits or field verification to ensure that oil and gas companies are completing closure work on requested sites. These processes are currently being developed and will be integrated into our existing compliance programs. Tammy, I'll turn it back to you to summarize the key dates and milestones for the closure nomination program, and she'll also show you the survey questions and explain next steps.
Thanks, Jocelyn. I'll just keep my video off due to previous technical issues, and it's not important to see me on video. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us today. We only have a few more slides for you, so thanks for sticking with us. We want to note that the closure nomination program has specific government-driven timelines for delivery. The original timeline to have the closure nomination program implemented was September 30th of this year. However, in collaboration with the government of Alberta, the timeline was extended to accommodate more external engagement, which is taking place now, and then have program implementation by March 31st, 2023. Our goal with our September and October engagement sessions is to seek feedback on specific components and processes of the closure nomination program. And I mentioned that in the beginning here of this presentation. Once these engagement periods are done, we will consider all of the feedback and finalize the program during December and January. And then in February and March, we will be focused on preparing for implementing the program. And then we will start accepting site closure requests the beginning of April 2023. Next slide. So these are the survey questions we've told you about. So as mentioned, you will receive a survey within 2 to 3 days of today's session. This is a sample of what the survey questions will look like. Next slide. So next steps, this is pretty much our last slide here. We want to remind you that we will have a video link to this information session available on the AER website. A link to the survey questions about the closure nomination program will again be emailed to you, and we ask that you please complete the survey no later than Friday, October 28th. A link to the recorded session will also be included with the survey email, so you don't have to go searching for it on our website. The requirements, or what oil and gas companies must do for the closure nomination program, will be added to Directive 88, which is called Licensee Lifecycle Management. And there's going to be a public comment period planned for November, as was mentioned in the beginning of this presentation today. And this, of course, will be your second opportunity to provide feedback on the program. Next slide. So finally, this last slide provides a link to the YouTube videos we've mentioned before that explain the liability management framework. We have also listed a few email addresses if you have any questions. Darlene, I'll pass it back to you.
Thanks, Tammy and Jocelyn. So before we start addressing any questions about the information presented today, we'll just take a 5-minute break, as we talked about in the beginning. And during this time, the Q&A function will be open. So it's on the, I just want to tell you where it is if you're not familiar. So it's on the top of your screen next to the hand raise. There's a Q&A little icon there, and you can enter your questions there. And there'll be somebody in the background kind of going over the questions and publishing them. So I'm just looking at the time, it's 10:10, perfect. So at 10:15, we'll begin again. And just please remain connected with the session during the break if you wish to continue with the Q&A period. And we'll see you all back here at 10:15. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I just want to remind people, if you have questions, to use the Q&A function, as there's not the ability to answer your questions if you raise your hand. So if you have any difficulty with that, then you can email that email that was at the beginning. So Christy Brose at AER. So I'm not seeing any published questions, but really for the next little bit of an hour, we kind of allotted the time to kind of go through questions, and there's somebody in the background that would be theming the questions that are in scope of the presentation today. So we'll just give it kind of a few minutes, and I'm not seeing questions, so give you time to put some questions in if you have any. I see that there haven't been any questions that have been emailed in. Well, we have our first question published, and I just want to remind people, if you raised your hand on that hand function, we can't address that. So please put your question in the Q&A, or otherwise email the link that was given at the beginning of the presentation. So the first question is from Daryl. Do you have a list of what FNs have nominated so far?
I can answer that one, Darlene. It's Jocelyn. So I don't have the list in front of me right now, but based on the SRP data, we do know what First Nations sites have nominated sites, I guess, through the SRP program. But I don't have that list in front of me right now.
Thank you. So, thank you, Christy. Christy put her email just in the Q&A piece. So if you have questions and can't access or are kind of confused about the Q&A function, please email your question to the email that you see on your screen right here. And Christy did note she's not getting any questions as of yet. So another question from Daryl. Can you elaborate on what types of sites they are, or are they regular oil and gas sites?
So Daryl, when you say O and G, I'm assuming you're meaning oil and gas sites. That's what I'm going to assume. So my understanding is, yes, there are oil and gas sites. I don't know that there's anything specific. We haven't dug that deep into those sites to know, for example, what is on those sites, or if there's anything you know, complex or high risk or anything like that. We just at this point have a list of sites and know where they are, but we don't have that detail.
Thank you.
I've noticed that someone, I think their name is Tim, has raised their hand, but again, we're not able to. So I don't know if they need the email address again for Christy Brose, or
Darlene, this is Tammy.
Go ahead, Tammy.
Our information letter from the IOGC regarding Section 78 just went up this morning. The link is going to be provided, but we just got that from the IOGC message.
Okay, thank you. Are we going to provide the link in the Q&A or at a later date?
Yeah.
So I think Christie's graciously going to publish that link into the Q&A so that if anybody wants to take a look at that, they can. So right here from the IOGC. We'll just hang out and wait to see if there's any more Q&As.
So looks like we have a question.
Yeah, I see it in the from the email.
Yeah.
So question from email is, why are the options for the First Nations to nominate sites only limited to sites on reserve? It would make more sense if First Nations could nominate sites on their traditional territory as well as on the reserve.
So I can answer that one as well. It was how the oil and gas rules were written in terms of the regulation. So that was the guidance that we were provided by the government of Alberta, is for reserve lands, Band and Council can submit a request into the AR. For traditional lands, my understanding is that would be part of the minister request. And we don't have the details on that process yet.
Thank you. So there's another published question from...
Sorry, if I could just add to that question. Hey everyone, Vishal Saini from Indian Oil and Gas Canada. If it's non-reserve lands, but it's owned by the First Nation in regards to a fee title or potential addition to reserve, as a landowner, the First Nation could still nominate sites on those lands, but I agree with Jocelyn when it comes to traditional land, that this doesn't fall in there, but if the First Nation is the landowner of off-reserve lands, they're still eligible for this program.
Thank you for that clarification, Michelle.
Yep, no problem.
Thank you. So another question that's come in is from Daryl. So are these only oil and gas sites that can be nominated, or gravel pits along with any other resource development site can be nominated? Thank you.
I'm actually not sure if I can, in terms of when they're cleaning up the site, I'd have to get some clarification in terms of what does that all include on that site, because I know it's the wells and facilities, but I have to get some clarification, and I don't know if there's anyone on the line that can help with, does it also include, for example, if there's associated gravel pits on that site? So that might be a question we have to take away for that. So I don't know that like a gravel pit itself could be nominated. That's the piece that I'm not sure about. And also the side is if it's within that oil and gas activity on that site. So Daryl will have to take that one away. And thank you.
So, and just a little friendly reminder, if you press the hand raise button that you see at the top, we can't address that question. It would have to go through the email down below from Christy right here, or else into the Q&A portion of the Teams. So from Daryl again, thanks Daryl. So he's saying this is a comment, not a question. They are not traditional lands, they are treaty lands protected by the Constitution. Thanks, Daryl.
And the only other comment, I just came back online, just someone did message me and say that if the site is not regulated by the, in terms of an oil and gas site, if it's not regulated by the AAR, then it's not eligible to be submitted into the closure nomination program. So that might also help with that question around the gravel pits and things like that. So if it's an activity that's not regulated by the AAR, so outside of oil and gas, then it would not be eligible for this program.
Thank you. And there hasn't been any email questions submitted yet. So we'll just give it some more time to see if there's any more questions or comments with regards to the presentation today. There's nothing kind of in the background being reviewed. So I guess what I'll say too is the only time the hand raise button would be beneficial would be if we're going to be closing it out, because if there's no more questions that you may have, then we would start closing it down. So if there's no questions within the next few minutes, but if you're typing a question or emailing a question, please raise your hand and then we'll wait for that question to come in. And I can't see on my end if there's any hands raised, so you guys will have to help me out with that. I'll just give it a couple minutes till 10:30. And just to kind of remind you guys, when the survey is sent out, if there's a question that comes up where you need time to kind of go over the presentation or mull over kind of the information that you heard, you can submit questions with the survey by that date that was given earlier, October 28th. So if something comes up for you, I'll just give it a couple more minutes. And I'll just read out what came from email. Thank you for the responses. As feedback to the AER, it is important there is a clear process for First Nations to nominate sites through the minister. Will you be defining this process when you develop the directive?
In terms of the process with the minister, my understanding is that is actually being developed by the Department of Energy, that process. And once they develop what that process is, and then they would submit in their request to the AER for then it to be brought into the closure nomination program. So I think that answers that question there.
Thank you. And then just a comment from Daryl to say thank you for the comment clarification about treaty lands, much appreciated. Thanks, Daryl. So no more from Christy. Thanks, Christy. And I'm no more from Anita. Thanks, Anita. And unless somebody raises their hand, maybe we can close it out. So again, I'm just gonna try to move to the next slide for you guys, which is thank you. And I just want to say again, a reminder that if a question comes up for you later with regards to kind of what you heard today, that you can provide the question in the survey and the date for the survey submission, which will be sent out pretty quickly after this, as long as will be October 28th. And unless there's something else or somebody has some closing remarks, we will close the session. I guess Jocelyn or Tammy, is there anything from you guys?
No, I'll just say thank you very much for attending and listening today, and we really appreciate and look forward to your feedback through the survey, as that will help us to, improve the program where we can. So thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you,
Jocelyn.
everyone.
Thanks, Tammy. Okay, well, enjoy the rest of your day, guys. Take care.
Bye.